Hi, welcome to Design 101, Vintage Design on a Dime. I'm Emily Dix. I am the founder and artistic executive director of Bygone Theatre, and also the founder of the TITC, the Toronto Independent Theatre Coalition. So I'll start off by just telling you briefly a bit about me and my company. I have been doing vintage design for about 15 years. I do costumes, props, set somewhat. I've always loved vintage things, and the majority of the productions I've worked on have been vintage shows. That's part of why I started Bygone Theatre back in 2012, so that I could have an excuse to buy some antiques and put on some vintage productions. We do shows that are written or set in the early to mid 20th century, and you can learn more about Bygone at www.bygonetheatre.com. Now briefly about the TITC. The TITC was founded as a way to help small Toronto indie theatre groups come together and grow. There's no membership fees. It's sort of an energy exchange. So if you sign up, you basically agree to help support the other people in the coalition by sharing their resources, sharing information about their productions. You can learn all about it at www.thetitc.ca. You can also apply there to be a member. And if you like what you see today, please do check out our website, check out Facebook, Instagram, give us a follow or a like. The more people that hear about us, the bigger we can become, the stronger we can become. So let us know. And also let us know if there is a type of workshop that you'd like to see or anything that you'd like to see us do, because we are a coalition. We do want to be representing everybody. Okay. So as for what we're going to go over today, the first half is going to be sort of general stuff for just all indie designers. And because I am a producer, a lot of it's going to come from kind of a producing point of view as well. The second half will get into some more specifics about period productions, and I'm going to use examples from shows that I've done. If you have any questions at any point, you can just throw them out in the chat if it's something relevant to what we're talking about right then. And there will be a Q&A section at the end. You can also go to our website, again, the titc.ca, and go to the resources tab. And there you'll find under the TITC webinar folder, you'll see one for Design 101, and you can download a copy of this PowerPoint PDF, as well as a list of design resources. Okay, so we're going to start off with what I call the big three: good, fast, and cheap. This is my puppy, Frances, by the way. I'm sorry, she's probably going to interrupt sometimes. Good, fast, and cheap are the three things that everybody wants out of design. And unfortunately, you can only ever have two at a time. So here's a really basic example of how you can get good, fast, or cheap. If you're going to a rental store, chances are you can rent something that's good. You can probably get it quickly because they have a lot of resources, but it's not going to be cheap. If you go to something like Value Village, there's a chance you could find something good. And there's a chance you could find something fast, and you're almost guaranteed to get it cheap. But the likelihood of all three of those, Frances, is slim. I'm just going to pass her over to Connor here so he can take her out. It's my girl. She was quiet until we started this, of course. Dollarama is another place I get a lot of stuff from. And again, that's something you can get fast, but it's not going to be good quality. It will be cheap. And then, of course, there are auctions, and that's sort of a hit or miss. You can have possibly find something good, possibly find something fast, possibly find something cheap, probably not all of them. Basically, when you're doing design, especially indie design, you're always going to want it good and cheap. So you need to give yourself time. And that's something that producers and directors need to remember as well. You can't, Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither is your set or your props or costumes. So to make sure that you can manage to put together a good design that follows the big three, there's some key questions that you need to ask as a designer. So first, there's your production questions. When you are first meeting with your producer or director, you need to figure out what exactly it is that they want done, which sounds really obvious, but I cannot count the number of times that I've had meetings with people and it seemed really clear, like we all know exactly what we want. And then later you find out, no, it was people have something completely different in their mind than what you're doing, and it turns into very stressful situations. So it's really important to have a very clear outline from the beginning. You need to know what your budget is. And producers, be honest about this. It's not helpful for a designer to be told like, well, what do you need? Because in an ideal world, I don't know, we need $10,000 to do costumes for your 2-person show. You know, there's so much you can do with so many different types of budgets. We need to be told what you've got, and then we can creatively figure out how to work that. So if your budget is $50 a person, let your designer know that. Then we need to know, when do you need it? So obviously you need stuff for the show, but depending on the director, some of them want to have all of the props in the room first day of rehearsal, which is usually quite a bit before the show. So things like that, knowing, you know, if you need the finished product, then if there are costume changes that you need to work on, so you need to have those a fair bit before the opening. You just need clear deadlines. Who approves it? This one is very important. Personally, I think that when you're working with a designer, the designer and the director need to figure out what they want things to look like, but then the designer is the one who is the expert on the look of things, and so they have final say. Most of the people I've worked with, that's how they do it. But of course, there are productions where the director wants final say on everything. And sometimes that goes as far as they want to. Sorry, that's my budgie Felix. There's a lot of animals in here. Goes as far as wanting to approve every single thing that you purchase. So you need to know what the process is for getting something. Is it as simple as me saying, okay, well, you need a red dress for this actress. I know her size. I'm going to go find a red dress. I know that's what the director wants. It's approved. Or do I need to call the director and say, what about this red dress? Does this work? And get that specific one given the okay. I won't go into what's better or anything there, but you just make sure that you know how that's going to work. And that's very clear, so you don't end up with frustration. Because personally, when I'm doing design, I end up spending a lot of time going all over the place. Sometimes you find something and you have to get it right then to be able to get it, especially with vintage items. So if you don't have it worked out how that process is going to be, it's going to stall you, and it could mean not getting some things that you need. Who do you need to coordinate with? So a lot of my shows, I end up doing all of the design work. Which makes it easier in some ways because there's nobody that I have to consult with. I just have to make sure it fits in my budget and that it, fits the show. But you could easily have a show that has a costume designer, a different prop designer, a different set designer, different lighting designer, and all of those things need to come together to create a cohesive whole. So make sure you know who you need to talk to and about what. If your lighting designer has no idea what colors your set is going to be, that can be a problem. You can end up with a really muddy looking set. If your prop designer is doing really stylized props and you're doing very realistic looking costumes, that may look out of place. So again, just make sure that you know what everybody is working on and you know how you need to coordinate it. What does the item need to do? How and for how long? So when you're doing vintage design, one of the problems you'll come across is it's quite easy to find vintage things, but finding a vintage thing that doesn't look old and worn out and isn't going to fall apart if you're using it in a show, that gets more difficult and more expensive. So say you need a couch. You could go and find a vintage couch that if all it is someone sort of perching on the edge of it once a show, and then it's fine. But if the director decides then, actually, I want 3 people jumping up and down on it, it might not be sturdy enough for that. So you need to know how the item is going to be used. Same for costumes. Is it something where they get something spilled on them? Are you going to be able to get the stains out of it? Is it something that needs to be able to come on and off quickly? Props. If it's a food prop, does it have to actually be consumed? Or can it just be a fake thing? Does it need to be the item it actually is? Can it be the item it actually is? You don't want ice cream on stage, but you probably also don't want to make your actor eat an entire bowl of mashed potatoes. So just figuring out what exactly everything needs to do and how. Along with that, special concerns, allergies, food sensitivities or preferences. that especially comes up with props, but costumes as well. I'm allergic to wool. If someone wanted me to wear a wool dress, I would be on stage in hives. So make sure you're aware of all of those things. And then finally, how does the venue affect the design? If you're doing a site-specific show, that's going to have very different needs than something in a black box theater. So we'll get into that a bit more later. Then after you go through all of those kind of boring nitty-gritty production questions, you need to start getting into your artistic questions. So where and when is it set? Personally, I like to be really specific and choose like the day, month, year, what the weather is like. And when you're doing vintage design, you need to decide, are you going to follow something as strictly as that? With Bygone, we do. So if we're doing a show that's set in 1954, nothing that is used in that show, including the music, is anything that you would see coming out after 1954. On that, if you're doing something set in a specific year, that doesn't mean everything has to be from 1954. You have to think about what the characters are like. So, you know, and maybe it's a newlywed couple, maybe they do have some new things that are from the 50s, but maybe they also have some furniture they inherited from their family that's from the 1930s, right? So don't feel like just because something's set in a certain year that everything has to come from that year or even necessarily that decade. And you have to know, is this real life or is it some kind of fantasy world? So again, with my company, we tend to do things that are set in a very specific time. So we want something as accurate as possible. But you could also do something that just has sort of a general feel. Maybe it's just sometime 1950s, mid-century. Maybe you want something that's like a 1930s MGM musical, which is not at all like what the 1930s really were, but is a very specific style in and of itself. Maybe you want something that is set in the future and has kind of a retro feel to it, or something set so far in the past that we don't really know what it looked like. Whatever it is, just make sure that you define that clearly. Then you need to think about what mood you want to convey. Is it a comedy? Is it a drama? Do you want the costumes and set to immediately make you feel like you're somewhere dark and oppressed? Or do you want it to feel really cheery and hopeful, and then maybe something horrific happens there and that contrast is really interesting? So figure out what kind of mood you want. Then ask yourself, how does the set, prop, costume add to the story? This is something really important to do when you're working on a tight budget and you may need to sort of trim back some of the stuff you want to do. It's easy to say, oh, I want to have this and this and this. And I love dressing sets. I love filling in little knickknacks and things that the audience doesn't necessarily see. But if you're trying to cut some costs, ask yourself with each thing, how does this add to the story? How is this going to affect the action of the play or the characters are in it? And if you can't answer that, it might be something that you can cut. Even if it is stuff you're keeping in, think about how it would affect people. You know, how's the actor going to feel seeing, like as their character, seeing these old photos up or seeing the collection of books you've picked? Yeah. And then finally, do you need the real thing or can you fake it? So just because it's a vintage production doesn't mean that everything you get has to be old. There's lots of ways to take something new and make it look old. And there's lots of dupes where you can find something new that will pass for something old, especially depending on what sort of overall mood and look you've decided to go with for your show. So we'll get into that a bit more later. But there's just some basic questions that every designer should be asking the people they're working with. And if your designer, if you're a producer, director, and your designer isn't asking you that, make sure you ask them and tell them and lay that all out and put it in a contract. And if you're wondering about contracts, check out our website and you'll find a link to our Producing 101 and Producing 101 Part 2, especially, where we talk more about contracts and how important they are and what sort of stuff you should be putting in them. Okay. Dealing with difficult answers. Again, as I said, because I'm a producer, I'm going to keep coming to some of this design stuff from a producing point of view. I think more than a lot of the other roles in theater, designers get a hard rap. Probably partly because some design stuff are things that while it does take a lot of skill, people who haven't done it can look at it and be like, well, I know how to do that. Say you're a costume designer and you're dressing a show and you're not required to sew anything. You're just going to go and source stuff. A lot of people, I think, can look at that and be like, well, I can go out and buy clothes, especially if you're not looking for vintage stuff. I can go to H&M and buy something. Sure, but there's a reason you get a designer, because they not only have a better understanding of the costumes and how to wear them and what's going to work best, but they also have knowledge of resources, where to get things for a good deal. So point being, if you're a designer, chances are at some point you're going to deal with some difficult people and some difficult answers. So here's a few examples of ones I've come across and my suggestions for how you could deal with them. The design is not being finalized fast enough. So this can be on either end. It could be you are being told that your design is not being finalized fast enough, or it could be you've got a director who has something specific he wants, but he's not moving fast enough and telling you what this thing is. Go back to the big three. Remind them and yourself that things can be good, fast, cheap. You can only have two of them. Make sure you stand your ground. If you need time to work on something, be clear about that up front and explain why it's worth taking the time to plan. And if you're waiting on somebody, remind them that you need a certain amount of time to do things, and that if they don't get things rolling, you can't get things rolling. And that it's not fair of them to put that on you if you're delayed because of that. Another problem is a director who wants something contrary to your design. This is where contracts are really important. You need to know from the start who gets final say, and then you need to stick to that. So if you've gotten your design that as the designer, you get final say in the look of something, and your director doesn't like that, remind them of the contract, get your producer to back you up, they'll have to deal. Likewise, if your contract says that the director gets a veto on things and wants you to do something that you don't like, you might just have to do it. I think in theater, because as artists, we tend to be really passionate and put every part of ourselves into what we're doing. Sometimes the idea of doing something that isn't like your perfect thing just seems horrifying to you. But remember that it is a job. And in basically every other industry, you're going to have days where you're doing stuff you don't want to do. So you have to kind of balance, if it's something so bad that you feel like I can't have my name attached to this because of it, let them know. I have had that happen. And I have made the choice to say, well, I guess I'm not going to take the credit for this because it's now not my design. But if it's something you're being paid for, maybe you'll just do some you don't bother to put in your portfolio afterwards. That's fine. Another problem can be you're working with people you fundamentally disagree with. Sometimes we go into something and it seems really great. We seem like we're going to mesh really well. Then as things get rolling and the stresses pile up, you realize that you're working with people who just have different fundamental ideas than you do. The main thing is you have to remember to value yourself, your time, and your energy. Make sure that you are getting out of things as much as you're giving. If it's not paying the bills and it's making you feel bad, it is okay to quit. It's okay to leave. This may be kind of an odd thing to bring up in a design workshop, but I think it's something that all of us need to remember in theater. It's not worth making yourself sick over, so choose who you work with carefully. And if you really find that it's really getting to you and you can't do your best work and be your best self, and you've tried to work it out with them, it is okay to cut ties and say no more. So to wrap that up, things to remember: Rome wasn't built in a day. Good things take time. As a designer, you need to not be afraid to set realistic expectations about your time and your budget, to say no to producers or directors who want something that's impossible, because that will absolutely happen, and to stand up for yourself, your design, and your knowledge. If you've been brought on as a designer, that's because you're the one who is the expert in it, right? You know more about it than the director or the producer does. That's why they want you there. It's okay to remind them of that sometimes. Egos get inflated and you can have people bumping heads. Just stand back and say, look, you have to trust me. I know what I'm doing here. Let me do my design. As a producer, director working with a designer, make sure that you remember to be clear about your vision and your expectations. Be clear about who has final artistic say, and then trust your designers. They've done the research and the work, and if they tell you something can't be done or it can only be done a certain way, you need to respect that and respect that they know what they're doing and let them do that. At the same time, if you do actually have a designer who somehow really doesn't know what they're doing, as a producer, it's your job to know a bit of everything and to trust the people you work with, not to micromanage them, but to know enough about what they need to do that if they are really far off the path, you can take them aside and be like, why aren't you doing it this way? And maybe you'll find out there's something you don't know, or you might find out there's something they don't know, but just make sure you have clear communication about that. One more time for the people in the back, because this is the thing that comes up. It is okay to quit. Definitely don't go into something thinking I'm just going to quit if there's any problem. Like, you know, take your time to make sure that the project you're working on and the people you're working with are things you can commit to. And, you know, theater is very much a collective thing. So do be aware that if you just drop everything, that will have an effect on the other people you're working with. But at the same time, if you've tried all of that and you've gone through your contracts and you've been clear about expectations and people just aren't following through, it's not worth making yourself miserable for a gig. Stand up for yourself. Know that it's okay to move on. Okay, now we're going to get into the actual vintage design part of things. So 20th century design is what I have the most experience with. So we're going to look at a few of Bygone's past productions. So I've sort of broken things down into kind of main categories of shows we've done. So one is site-specific productions. We've done 2 so far. We did Doubt, a Parable in 2013. That was our first. We did Rope in 2014 at the Gibson House Museum. And then it was supposed to be this June, but now because of COVID is pushed ahead to April of 2021. We're doing The Party Line, which is going to be an immersive piece at Campbell House Museum. So when you're doing a site-specific show, there are pros and cons. Pros, there can be creative direction and design. And often there's minimized set and venue costs, which can allow for greater spending in other areas. Cons, costumes and props need to match the quality level of the space. So for instance, when we did Rope, which is these guys here, we were in Gibson House Museum. So being in a historic home, everything there was authentic. And if we had gone in with costumes and props that looked like something we picked up at Party City, it would have looked ridiculous. Whereas if you're doing something in a black box and you decide that's the style that you want, you could, as long as you do it cohesively, that can still be a really strong looking piece. There's often a lack of lighting design, or at least a minimal lighting design, and you have to be creative with it. So that's a thing to consider. And then usually the audience is closer to the actors than they would be in a theater, which can mean that you need to have more attention to detail and really be making pieces that are more film quality than theater quality. All that said, even in spite of some of the issues with it, our site-specific shows were actually our most profitable in terms of profit loss, not in terms of the most money brought in, the most tickets, because they've had some of our smallest houses overall. I think Rope, we could fit like 27 people in there. But it is a chance to be profitable if you plan it right. So continuing with Rope, here's our little cast picture of our lovely actors there. For this show, we managed to get a sponsor. We got David Dunkley, who is a milliner who has done, he's won tons of awards, and he's done hat design for royals. And I reached out to him and said, hey, we need hats for the show. Would you be interested in being a sponsor? And he said, yes. So this is where one of these trusting your designers things comes in. We were lucky enough to have somebody who's very experienced agree to make our hats. But because he was a busy milliner, we didn't really get much say in it. I showed him what the costumes were going to be and the colors and said, I want this sort of thing. And then we got them like the day we got into the space, which turned out great. But it could not have as well. So there's one as a producer and as the director, I needed to be like, I'm going to just trust this and let him do his thing. Still with rope, we've got Chelsea McLean and Matt McGrath there. Working on the costumes, we decided that, I guess, the best thing to do was to keep the men in suits and have that were purchased, and to make the women's clothing from scratch. So if you can sew and you're a designer, that's a big help. I am a mediocre sewer at best, but I'm lucky enough to have a mother who sews very well and who will sometimes make some things for me. So I went out and found fabric that was on sale from Fabricland. It's really important to know when you're doing costumes, to know about trends and seasons so that you can figure out when stuff will be on sale. This show went up in November, and thankfully I wanted it in a dark color palette. But if I had been trying to do something with bright spring colors in the fall, I would have had a really hard time finding the fabric for that. And it would have cost a lot more money unless I had thought to plan it and purchase that back in May. So you need to keep those things in mind. Knowing that they were going to be seen up close, I did a lot of hand work, which you can't really see here. Like this thing on Chelsea, part of this was a purchase thing, but there is tons of hand beading that took hours and hours and hours on that. We also made sure that she knew how to do authentic hair and makeup because she was going to be seen up close. And since she was going to be up close, we decided to go with something that looked like what the people could actually do themselves. If this had been on stage, I might have considered getting her a wig so she could have really perfect, beautiful 1920s hair. But since I couldn't afford the type of wig that would look that good up close, we decided it was better to just have her do her own hair and have it look like something a real person would have. Another example of something that took hours is Elizabeth here, Elizabeth Rose Morris. This dress has a chiffon capelet and skirt, which had to be sewn by hand. So that comes back again to making sure that you have time. We made something good and we made something fairly cheap, but because we wouldn't have been able to afford to buy something that quality from that time period, we had to make it from scratch, and it took a very, very, very long time. So another sort of category here is big designs, small budgets. So two of our larger shows that we did were His Girl Friday, which we did in 2017, that had a cast of 18 and a total of 22 characters. The Rear Window, which we did in 2019, had a 2-story set and 9 actors. So both of those were big productions in different ways. Pros are, of course, big design can mean big impact. These shows got more notice than some of our other ones. They got a good response. We got some good pictures of them. You have more room to play. You can add in more details if you want. And you can do simplistic and big and still have a strong impact, more than with a small, simple design. So the top one there, His Girl, was actually very simple in terms of design, but because it was on a big scale, it together still had a fairly large impact. Cons: it is expensive and time consuming. Getting that many costumes takes a lot of time and costs a lot of money. Putting in all the details takes a lot of time. It requires a lot of detailed planning. And it just overall is lots of work. So here's a picture. We've got Cass Van Wyck and Sean Jacklin here and His Girl Friday. For this, we decided we wanted to make use of some of the stuff we had. So we had a lot of flats. We didn't have a lot of time, money, or space to do much with them in terms of decorating. So we went super simple and just did this ugly little 2-tone wall, which was common in the 40s, and threw those up and decided that we would focus on getting authentic looking pieces for what the actors actually interacted with. So we got lots of wooden chairs, a lot of phones. This beautiful 1920s desk here was in the garbage, and we found that was a great find. Our file cabinets. and focused on details like their cigarettes, because everybody was smoking like that back then. So to give you an idea of what some of these things cost, this was our first very expensive show. We had done several shows that were between $3,000 and $5,000 each. This one stretched us, but we decided we needed to kind of do something a little bigger to start getting noticed. So to give you an idea, the set and props for this show, we spent $1,362. The venue, as it is with all of our shows, was our major expense, $3,955. This was at a Key studio, and we were there for a week. The costumes, we did super cheap, $597. So when you have a cast of 18 or 22 characters, that averaged out to $27.13 per person. The way I managed to do that was knowing what things you can get cheap and reusing everything you can. So again, the women I tend to spend more money on because it's easier to recognize women's vintage fashion from different periods than it is men's. So the ladies' costumes definitely cost more than $100 each. Hildy's was sewn for her. It was a custom suit that my mother thankfully made for me. The dresses I had for Elizabeth and Ashley, those were ones that I found from vintage stores. But the men were just in white dress shirts. I have quite a large collection of vintage ties, so those were authentic. And because they were all supposed to just sort of look like they're, journalists sitting around, we could keep them a lot more casual looking, which is a much cheaper look to do. So we got men's dress shirts and dress pants from Value Village. We rented some hats, and then we decided to spend the money on the suit that Walter, the lead man, wore. So he had an authentic 1940s suit, which cost more, but I think it was still only about $150 off of eBay. So we chose what things were going to be focused and have the authenticity, and then made sure that the other stuff looked cohesive, and we managed to do it much cheaper. One final note on this, one of the major things that we got a huge break on is this desk that you see back here. So one of the key things in His Girl Friday is an actor needs to be able to hide in a roll top desk. So we knew from the beginning that that was going to be a challenge. Finding any roll top desk that's affordable is difficult. A lot of them are about half this size. So finding something big enough an actor could fit in was going to be hard. And it's not an easy thing to build. These are complicated, so that wasn't really an option. But we did know that the Shaw Festival had done a production of The Front Page, which is a very similar story. And so we reached out to them when it's not their busy season, and we said, do you happen to still have the desk? And lo and behold, they did. So we managed to borrow this from them. I mean, you have to rent a truck and get out to Niagara, but this piece here is worth around $5,000 and is something we could not possibly have done on our own. But because we planned ahead, had some connections, some fairly minor connections to the Shaw Festival, but just reached out to the right people at the right time and said, could you help us out? We managed to. So this, we actually had against a wall, and so we didn't even use it the full way it could, but this back piece could fold out so that the actor wouldn't have to stay in the desk the whole time. It was beautiful. So that was very lucky. So that's one of the things, is making sure you know what kind of shows the larger theaters have put on, and just asking them. Shaw and Stratford have huge warehouses with props and costumes, and they do have things that they'll rent out. Make sure you talk to them when it's not the busy season. Be really clear about what you're looking for, and be grateful. Just be friendly about it. Not everything they're willing to rent, but something like this, even though they spent a lot of money on it for that production, how often do you need a desk that has a back that pops out, right? So yeah, just make sure you stay aware of what companies may have things that could be beneficial to you. So when we did the Rear Window, we spent a lot more money on the venue than we normally did, because we knew by getting this venue, we could save some money on the design itself. So we were in TPM, Theatre Passe Muraille, because in their main space, they have a balcony that we knew we could act off of, that you can see parts of here. To build a 2-story set, would have been very, very expensive. Making something that was up that high, was to this scale, safe, was just not going to be possible. Also because we don't have a space to build, which I think is a problem that a lot of indie people have. When you don't have a space where you can prep all of this stuff, you've got to be a little more creative. So we set out knowing we had to use this venue. We managed, though, to then only spend about $1,700 on the set, which is pretty good for the size of it. So this is not a great picture, but I don't have a good picture that shows the full set. Our lighting designer, Wes Babcock, did beautiful lighting design. It doesn't show up great in my photos. So this is just to give you an idea. Right at the end here, you can see we have one space here. It's an apartment with a balcony. There's another apartment here, another one here. This is the main apartment. And then downstage right here is another one. So it required a lot of different spaces. We had little vignettes that all had to look really different on their own. I had more planned for these apartments up here, but then we got there just wasn't the space. I did actually want flats behind them to get more distinct colors in them, but still to try and have distinctly different looking places. We use things like curtains and window boxes and laundry hung out. It's another example of the two different apartments. So for this show, our set cost $1,731. Our props cost $451. Our costumes were $972. Our venue was, again, the major cost at $9,140. And our lighting, which was a very, very low fee for my lovely friend who did our design, as well as the cost of the gels, was $425. So with a cast of 9 characters, that averaged out to $108 per person for costumes, which is closer to what I usually budget. So for this show, I did a lot of the design. I did the set, I did the props, I did the costumes, and I did the sound. As a producer or a director, one of the most important things you need to do at the beginning is recognize what you can do and what you can't do. I knew I could do the costumes and the props. I was fairly confident I could do the set. I was fairly confident I could not do the sound, and that I could not do the lighting. Knowing what was possible with the set, I thought lighting is something that we need to get a person for, even more than the set, because this is a show that's going to rely on creative lighting so much. So I made sure to have a lighting designer who I need to coordinate with when doing all the other things. Probably should have coordinated with him a little more. I think he was a little frustrated with me when we moved in with some things. But knowing that that was something I couldn't do and making sure that I found somebody who was an expert in that was something really important. I wanted to do the same with the sound design, and we just didn't have the money. So designer, director me was like, I can't do that. We need someone else. And producer me said, too bad, it's you or nothing. And it turned out okay, but that was definitely my least favorite part of the show. The reviews reflected that as well. And if I ever manage to put it on again, I will make sure that we have the money for a sound designer. Yeah. Was there anything else I wanted to say about those? I don't know. I'll leave it at that now. So in case this is helpful, here's just some average costs that Bygone, oops, sorry, I don't mean to move that, that Bygone uses. When I'm budgeting stuff, costumes, I usually budget $100 per person, knowing that men's costumes will likely cost less and women's will cost more. That is a super, super low estimate. I do that when it's my show and I know that I have control. Hello. And that I have control over it and that I have a lot of time to do it. Producers, if you are hiring somebody and looking to come up with a budget, I would say that is the minimum you want to do. We also reuse a lot of costumes, especially men's basics. We have a basement that is full of props, sets, and costumes. We moved further out of the city so that we could have a larger space to store these things. So that's a thing you need to consider as well. Generally, I prefer to buy over rent. I usually find it's a better price and we have the place to store it. But if you don't, and it's something you're using for a short amount of time, make sure you talk to people and see if you can rent, borrow, because you don't want to just be left with all these wonderful things that you have nothing to do with after. For our sets, we typically budget between 1,000 and 1,500, knowing again that we own a large amount of flats. We've got about 20. We also have door flats, as well as a kitchen set and some basics. So that again is kind of on the low end. That's planning on us, maybe having to build a different flat or add some trim, as well as getting furniture pieces. Sometimes we've done it for way less than that, but it's always better to budget a little high. Props I usually budget anywhere between 200 and 400, knowing that a lot of them are things I'm going to make from scratch, that we own a large collection of smalls, which is just what we call in the antique field, any little, from like pins to cigarette holders, just little prop pieces. And that this budget is mostly for specific major pieces. If we really needed one show, we really need a safe. But I don't generally have to go out and buy any more things like cigarette cases or lighters or whatever, because we have a lot of those. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's that for that. Okay, now we're going to talk about color schemes and creating a cohesive design. So again, with some examples of ones I've done. This is from Wait Until Dark that we did back in 2016. So Wait Until Dark is about a blind woman. She's married to a photographer, and some con men show up, and she has to try and deal with them and them tricking her when she can't see anything. So it's set in the 60s. So right away, I thought of the old color photography that all had kind of like really saturated but really warm tones. And that was something that sort of stood out to me. I thought that would work as well, because knowing that a lot of the play took place in the dark, we wanted to have lighter colors so that we could still see what was happening. When it came to Susie's costume, Shannon LaHaye here, she's the character who is blind. So I figured she would probably pick a dress based on the feel more than the color. So she's wearing something that's kind of a drab color, but it's got lots of texture. You can't really see it here, but it's all like puckered and everything and detailed. But it's also a little bit out of date because they're not wealthy people. They're living in a basement apartment. We put this on in the rehearsal hall at Tarragon Theatre. We liked it because it had kind of an industrial feel. So we didn't bother doing anything with the floor because we wanted it to look like kind of a grubby basement apartment. There were some pipes that were exposed and things as well. Another thing that was an inspiration was the old packaging on things like frozen dinners or laundry detergent. The fridge plays a major role in this show. So knowing that we had to have an authentic looking fridge meant that our other kitchen pieces had to be real too. We couldn't buy an actual vintage fridge and then use a block as the stove. That would have looked ridiculous. So we got a full kitchen set that we still have, but we used again for Rear Window. Also knowing that we had to have authentic pieces there meant that the stuff in the fridge had to look real. So I spent a lot of time making reproduction food. And there's also a washing machine that shows prominently. So I also made some reproduction laundry detergent. Now you can go and buy old packages like that, but a lot of people collect them. So it can be surprisingly expensive. So what I more often do is go and find pictures of the labels online. If they're not in perfect shape, I just throw it into Photoshop and clean it up a little bit and print them off and stick them on boxes. Works well. It's a little time consuming, but it works much better. Yeah, and then just for the cost of the design for this, the men were really simple. Again, 60s men was, you look at getting the shape of the collar and things, right? Eric Minch here, who played the lead bad guy, we wanted in a nice looking suit. So we talked to the actor and he was in the market for a new suit. So we decided to split the cost of that, and we paid for part of it and he paid for part of it. So that's the thing to do too when you're trying to save on design. Talk to your actors, ask them if they have costume pieces or shoes especially that could be used for the show if they're comfortable with doing that. Sometimes you offer them some money in exchange for doing that. If you're doing an equity show, you'd need to. But sometimes they're happy to just wear it. I always ask about shoes because buying shoes for someone else is such a pain. It's hard to know what's going to be comfortable for them, and they probably want to rehearse with them from pretty early on. So I always start off my first rehearsal with, who here has shoes we can wear? So here's some of the design stuff from the rear window. So for this one, the main apartment, Jeff's apartment here for Tristan Claxton, I wanted to feel like the nice bachelor pads you saw in some 1950s movies. One of these here is from Rope. I think another one's from Pillow Talk. So lots of long lines, big shapes, modern shapes. That said, Jeff is not supposed to be a terribly wealthy man. So while he has a more modern looking couch and light, there's still not a lot of stuff on the walls. It's not decorated that well. His kitchen set's a little out of date. For the apartments around, we had less space to play with things. Kathleen Welch here, who plays the newlywed, because this couple was supposed to be newly married, they had nice new things. So they put up their new shiny pink curtains, and she had a window box she worked on, and everything she wore was bright and colorful and a little over the top. Whereas the Thorwalds here with Elizabeth Rose Morris and Nino Pruidi. Oh God, I'm saying his name wrong. I'm sorry, Nino. Supposed to be a couple that's been married longer. And so they had grungier colors. They had a bunch of religious iconography on the wall. Little details like that, that if you're doing a lot of shows like this and you just sort of have a collection of these old things, you can always throw up, and it helps add to the scene for the audience and the actors as well. Some of the things I put in here, most of the audience wouldn't be able to see, but like Jeff's desk was filled with all sorts of authentic little props and things that added to the character that I knew he was working on. So if you're doing props and you've got time, go for it. Usually the actors appreciate it. Sometimes I encourage them to create their own props. And with costumes, I often pick out the clothing and then bring a bunch of different accessories and say to them, go pick out the stuff that you want. I find it gives a bit more of an authentic look. Sometimes they pick things that I think that, oh, these other earrings go better with that, but not every person is great at matching things. So not every character needs to look totally put together just right. You know, I had enough purses to let the leading lady have a different purse for every outfit, but how many women actually do that? She ends up using her same basic purse and dressing the rest of it, you know, so things to keep in mind. And then in terms of lighting, we took a really cinematic approach, but I wanted it to still look like it could happen in the real world. So whereas in Wait Until Dark, we had stylized lighting that was meant to be unrealistic because it was supposed to be highlighting things that Susie would like sense. In Rear Window, I wanted all of it to be things that just looked a little uncanny because Jeff is slowly descending into madness and addiction. So like the red light here that's highlighting Kate MacArthur is an exit light that is always outside that door. It's on through the entire show, so that when she comes in the dark and we see just that, it's not as jarring suddenly having a really stylized red light. Our lighting designer, Wes, spent a lot of time getting really great gritty looking gels that gave everything kind of a sickly feel. And I asked him to take inspiration from like neon signs that could be outside the doors that reflect kind of weird lights on things. And he made some gobos that were great breakups to kind of look like things were shining through fire escapes. And that's why you get a lighting designer, because I was like, can you do this sort of thing somehow? And then he made it work and it was lovely. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some easy dupes, modern substitutes for vintage design. One of the things that you can check out as well, if you go onto the resource page, I have a link to my own blog that I don't write in that often, but I have done a bunch on how to dress vintage styles with modern clothes. So that's a thing you can check out, but I'll go through some specifics here. So here's just a few examples. If you want to do some 1950s men's suits and you don't have the money to buy 1950s men's suits, check out 1980s men's suits. Both of them were boxy and square. And if you go to Value Village, you are going to find a plethora of 80s men's suits. The main thing to remember with that is the thing that changed the most was the waistline for men. So if you really want to have an authentic vintage men's silhouette, you are going to need some high-rise pants. So sometimes it's worth splurging on the pants and then using modern shirts or jackets. If you're trying to do something like a 1920s house dress, like a casual dress, not a flapper thing, just like a flowy, comfortable day dress, try 1990s summer dresses. Both of them were long, loose, often floral. You'll find lots of 90s stuff in vintage stores as well, and Value Village. And 90s fashion is back in, so you might also find them in new stores. If you're looking for 1950s men's casual summer shirts, search resort shirts. That's the term they're using for them now. You can find them at H&M, Bonobos. The main thing is that they have a sort of square cut and they have a really open collar. And that's something that just instantly feels 1950s. They also tend to be a little shorter cut. So if you pair one of those with some actual vintage high-waisted pants, you can really quickly get a 1950s look for less than if you tried to actually buy a 1950s summer shirt. Another example is 1940s women's summer shoes. Wedge heels have a very 40s look, and they're back in style right now. So we'll see some of those here. Here's just a couple quick examples. This here is a 1930s chiffon dress that is selling for $416 on Etsy. And here's a fairly similar dress from H&M for $50. So of course, the differences you'll see in things, in the 30s, they didn't have material with stretch. So if you needed something with any kind of stretch, it would be cut on the bias. Whereas today you can get something with spandex. That can be fine, but make sure if you're wearing anything with spandex for a vintage look, you don't have anything too tight, because if you see it pulling, then in the way that it pulls with spandex, it's going to instantly look modern. The hemlines are often shorter on new things. This one is fine. This is still coming past the knee, so that totally passes. And this has some more ruffles here, but honestly, you could alter the neckline a bit there and do it, or simply throw this lady's hair up in some curls and get her a little hat, and that's a believable pass for a 1930s dress. Here's an example of those resort shirts. So this is a 1950s men's shirt, 180 bucks on Etsy. Getting 1950s men's colorful shirts like that, you're usually going to look at around $200 a pop. And of course, often there's wear. But for a very similar look, you can get this $15 one from H&M. The main things again are the square cut, how short it is. This one's a little bit long, but you could hem it. The open collar and the really bold patterns. Yeah. Here's a 1948 Sears catalog showing some summer shoes. And here again from H&M, 50 bucks. Yeah, these can pass for 40s or 50s. The ones that are more of a platform, less of a wedge, or kind of a 60s look. Just do some quick Google searches for the years. You'd be surprised at how modern some of the old shoes look. Not everything was a saddle shoe. If you're trying to do 50s shoes, ballet flats were what a lot of women wore, and those are really easy to find and cheap. So as a sort of general thing to do when you were trying to find something modern, pay attention to silhouettes. If you have trouble thinking off the top of your head what a silhouette of a certain time period is, literally Google 1928 silhouette. There's a lot of people out there who have made the actual just silhouettes to really show you the overall shape and how that changes. Women's hemlines are often shorter now, though in the past year or two, some longer ones are coming out. Sometimes they can be lengthened. Sometimes you could add some kind of trim to it. If you have a short actress, it might be able to work. But please, if you're trying to put somebody in like a 1950s circle skirt and you find one that has the right cut, but it's above the knee, don't put them in it. It looks stupid. So you can't always find a modern substitute, but keep an eye out for that. Again, men's waistlines are often lower now than they were, so make sure you get high-waisted pants. Some of those are coming back in. Sometimes you need to just buy vintage ones for that. The fabrics are different. There's a lot more stretch than there was. Try and go for cotton over spandex. And again, if you've got something that has stretch in it, be aware of how and where it stretches, because that can be a dead giveaway. Make sure you wear the right underwear. It helps to define vintage clothes, and it can give a better shape to modern ones. There's a video that we posted on our TITC Facebook where Gigi from Gigi's House of Frills here in Toronto talks about the importance of the right undergarments. If you have a 1950s dress, it doesn't matter what size you are. You could be a size 2, you could be a size 22. You were expected to be wearing a bullet bra and a corset. And that if you don't put those on, your shape is never going to look right. So whenever I'm doing a show in a time period when the women would wear corsets, I always start off and take the ladies aside and say, this has nothing to do with your body or how you're built or how you look. You're all lovely, but you're going to need corsets because that's just how the clothes were made. Like, it's true that women were smaller in the 50s, but people didn't naturally have these tiny little waists. They were cinched in. So make sure you have things that do that. It will make the clothes look so much better. Menswear has changed less than women's. So when in doubt, spend the money on the ladies and put the men's in basics. Most people are not going to look at a man and just, like, you got high-waisted pants and a white dress shirt. Most people aren't going to be able to look and say, oh, that's 1928 versus that's 1943. But if you try and put a woman in something that isn't pretty specific to a year, a lot of us can pick it out, at least the decade. Reproductions are often cheaper than the originals, but they almost always cost more than modern. So when you're trying to do, especially stuff pre-1950s, I think it's rarely the right choice to go with actual vintage clothing. They're old. The stuff will fall apart. I do have some dresses that are from the 1920s, but they're so delicate that in a play, the chance of them staying together is just nil. So while you can use some vintage stuff for your props and set pieces, with costumes, you really need to think about back to the how it's going to be used and for how long. There are a lot of sites that make reproductions for all different types of stuff. It's not cheap. Neither is hiring a seamstress. If you can sew, there are also, that's what I should add to that list, is a list of places to get vintage patterns. There are lots of places to get vintage patterns online and at Fabricland. So you can always sew an original. But again, those things will cost more than buying just pre-made modern clothes if it's something that you can adjust. And finally, keep it consistent. If one actor is wearing a completely authentic vintage outfit, then modern pieces are more likely to stand out and clash. So you have to do your design as a whole. If you don't have the money to put everybody in stuff that looks totally right, then just make the choice to be like, this is going to have kind of a general 50s feel. All the women will have full skirts and short sleeves tops, and all of the men will have jeans and white rolled up t-shirts. That's better than putting one of them in a gorgeous authentic thing and then dressing the rest of them in H&M. It's going to look strange. So make sure you know your budget from the top, how many people you need to dress, what they need to be able to do in it, and design for a whole. Now I'm going to just quickly go over some design resources. So if you go into the TITC site, you can download a page where I have many more, but I'm just going to highlight here a few that are some of my personal favorites. These are all ones I'd recommend. I list on the sheet as well which ones I'd recommend. For costume rental stores, you can go to Malabar and Theatrics. That's an example of good and fast, but not cheap. Theatrics is especially good if you're doing a musical. For vintage menswear and smalls, Kingpin's Hideaway has high-end men's fashion. He's got a lot of hats, lots of accessories, and he's very knowledgeable. So if you're looking for a specific thing, especially a specific thing about uniforms, then definitely talk to Jonathan Hagee of Kingpin's Hideaway. For vintage lingerie, Gigi's House of Frills, she sells vintage and reproduction lingerie for all sizes. So that can be really helpful for the under things. She also sells tights if you want to get some seamed stockings or some with garters. And she has a small selection of vintage reproduction makeup, like stuff from Besame. For vintage clothing and accessories, you can check out Gadabout. They've got a large selection of clothing, blankets, housewares, smalls. You can find just about anything that you need there, but it can be pricey. It also can be a little overwhelming if you're going and looking for a specific thing. So if you are, call them a few days ahead of time and they can help you find something, because they just have shelves and bins and boxes of all sorts of stuff. Another good one for the same sort of things is Victory Girl Vintage. She's got mostly women's clothing. You can check out her new store or her Etsy shop. For prop rentals, vintage and modern, you can go to the Prop Room. They've got a huge selection, just about everything you can think of. But prop rental stores tend to be aimed more at film, which has bigger budgets than we do, so it can be expensive. But with all of these, ask them about nonprofit discounts. And when we talked about this more in our producing one, but when you're asking people for a discount, be honest about what you have and what you can offer. If you are doing a little one-off indie show, it's not a great opportunity for them to be your sponsor. It's not going to get them, a bunch of customers or anything like that. They're doing it for goodwill and as a favor. And so just know that. Don't try and like build yourself up to be something you're not. Be honest. Say, this is what we're trying to do. This is what we have. Is there anything that you could do? And you'll often get a really good response. But again, make sure you plan ahead, are very friendly, and you're honest. Other resources. So again, there's a larger list on that sheet, but I always check out Etsy, eBay. Max Sold is one of my favorites. It's got local auctions and estate sales. It's a really good resource for getting vintage furniture for very low prices. I've gotten things for $1 on there before. You need to watch it regularly though. With all of these things, with vintage, it comes and goes so quickly and you may never find the same thing again. So you really need to be watching it all the time. I literally every single day am looking through these sites and keeping in mind, oh, that would work for this show and that would work for this show. And when I can, buying things and putting aside, knowing when I do a show like this is going to be perfect. Denise Ryan Auctions, they are in the States, but they do online auctions and they've got decent quality, very low price clothing that comes up every couple months. I've gotten a lot of stuff from them. Unique Vintage is vintage inspired clothing, 20s through 70s, and they've got a lot of stuff for plus sizes. So that's always the first place I go if I know I want a vintage looking plus size outfit, because that is something that's can be quite difficult to find. Collectif is from the UK, and they also have vintage inspired clothing and accessories. The shipping can get a little expensive, but there are some places in Toronto that carry some of their stock, like Doll Factory by Damsels. So that went pretty quickly, but I think that's a wrap. Yeah, so if you like today's webinar, you can go to our GoFundMe and make a donation that goes directly to the TITC. It doesn't go to me, it doesn't go to Bygone. It goes to helping to pay for like the costs of our website and for this Zoom membership. You can check out the titc.ca to find those downloads, to learn more about us, to apply to be a member. You can also check out stagedoorto.com, which is our sister site that has some blogs about Toronto indie theater. You can see bygonetheater.com and see stuff we've done in the past, or you can check out my personal website at emilydix.com. If you liked the webinar, be sure to follow the TITC, give us a like on Facebook. The bigger we are, the more people we can meet, the more we can bring together, and the stronger we can make all of our members. So it really helps when people share that around. If you've got any questions, let me know. And if you have any ideas for future webinars, also let me know. Just wait a second and see if anyone has anything to ask. I'm losing my voice. I don't think so. Okay. All right. I'm going to go. If you do have any questions, you can leave them on our Facebook page and I will answer them as soon as possible. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you again soon. Okay. Bye-bye.